Hello everyone, welcome to Dr. Pai's Astrology channel. This is Nav here, and today we are back with our part 4, most awaited, with Kṣaṇāti for Rahu Ketu transit over Taurus and Scorpio. Welcome, Kṣaṇāti.
Namaste, Nav. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be able to support the Dr. Pai team. And this is just a transit that is impacting our world on such a individual, global, and drastic level. I'm not sure if you're tuning into this for the first time, but both on Dr. Pai's and I's channel, we've already put out a 3-part series on this transit because it's going to last almost 2 years long. It's going to be impacting us in a very significant way. And we talked about how it's going to affect society. We talked about how it's going to affect each ascendant. And now we're going to get specifically, it's going to how affect the transit on the natal planets, or what they call in Sanskrit, the Gochar. So we're going to be getting to this in detail, but it's a very complex topic because not only will Rahu and Ketu be transiting certain natal planets based on Nakshatra and Rashi, but it could also be affecting a certain house. So we're going to split this up into 3 parts, Nav and I. Today we're going to focus on Rahu's return, which is when Rahu transits Rahu. We're going to focus on Ketu's return, where Ketu transits Ketu. We're going to focus on the Rahu Half Return, which is when Ketu transits Rahu. And we're going to focus on the Ketu Half Return when Rahu transits Ketu. And I'm also going to touch in general a little bit of a introduction into our next video about what to expect in terms of how Rahu's going to affect the transit of the other natal planets. But we're going to get very specific into the different houses about how Rahu and Ketu will be affecting your natal positions if you have Rahu or Ketu in either Taurus or Scorpio in your natal chart. So as usual, I'd like to start with chanting. So I'm just going to do a quick chant to Ganesha before we get started. Om Gananam Tva Ganapatim Havamahe Kavim Kavinam Upamastravastamam Jaistarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatanaha Surinvanu Tibihi Siddhasadanam Vakratanda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakayeshu Sarvada Siddhi Buddhi Shakti Sahita Shriman Mokshakarika Pataye Namo Namaha Nirvignam Kuru. Shri Ganesh, Om Namah Shivaya. So, first thing is, before we get into the specifics of Rahu and Ketu's transit in their natal positions, let's talk a little bit about how this transit will be impacting all of the Navagraha, all of the 9 major planets. Now, one of the very interesting things about Rahu and Ketu is when we look at the other 7 planets, other than Rahu and Ketu, they're said to have very defined friends and enemies. But just like there's debate as to whether Rahu and Ketu can be exalted or debilitated, there is also debate as to whether Rahu has friends and enemies. Now, there are certainly planets that it treats better than other planets, and there are certain planets that don't get along well with Rahu and Ketu. But Rahu and Ketu are so mystical and occult in their nature that we can't really label and just say, okay, Well, just because Rahu's transiting this planet, it's going to be negative, because it really could be quite the opposite depending on aspects, activations of the dasha, and things like that. And so, again, just generally, we don't take the same friend-enemy approach to Rahu and Ketu with the other planets as we take with, let's say, the sun and the moon and Jupiter and Venus and Mercury. It's a little bit of a different touch and take on it. Because the best friend you're going to have with Rahu Ketu is what you kind of call a frenemy.
Right.
A frenemy, which is a friend who sometimes acts like an enemy. It's a little bit of a mix. So first thing to discuss is when we look in the ancient Shastras, Rahu and Ketu are both said to be great enemies to the sun and the moon. And it even says that Rahu eats the sun and the moon.
Right.
And Ketu causes the eclipse on the sun and the moon. And so when we get into the second part is malefic effects on planets, we'll definitely include the sun and the moon, because when Rahu and Ketu are with the sun and the moon, it's not always negative, because it can have to do with a lot of ancestral power and things like that, like moon Ketu connections. People are very empathic. People have strong ancestral energies. And Rahu's sun people are very powerful. They can be very powerful. They can have large egos, which of course you have to be careful about. But just to note, we'll discuss it in the different houses, but generally speaking, if you have Rahu and Ketu coming to transit on your natal sun or your natal moon, that's considered inauspicious classically.
Mm.
Other inauspicious transit is Rahu on Mars.
Right.
And right now Mars is in its root position and it's retrograde. And so if you have natal Mars in Taurus and Rahu's coming to meet your natal Mars, this could be a very difficult period. And we'll discuss in the second part how it would affect the different houses. But just know that that house will be targeted and affected in a difficult way. Now, differently, Ketu is friends with Mars. And Ketu is said to be akin with Mars. So this is an example of the friend-enemy relationship, which we'll go through. So again, Ketu's friends with Mars. You're looking at Mercury, which is not friends with Ketu, does pretty well with Rahu, so that transit could be beneficial. Saturn does well with Rahu and Ketu from a technical perspective. And Venus is friends with Rahu, less friends with Ketu, more neutral with Ketu. And then Rahu is said to be neutral to Jupiter and kind of friendly with Ketu. But I just wanted to give a little intro on what we're going to be doing in the future. But right now we're going to be focusing on the transit of Rahu and Ketu on their natal positions.
Okay.
Now, everyone is always talking about their Saturn return and their Sati Sati.
Right.
But I would say it is equally valuable and important to note the Rahu Ketu return in a person's chart. Of a lot of the people I've done readings for, my personal life, other professional astrologers, the most powerful and successful times of their life were during these periods of the Rahu Ketu return or half return. For example, when I was experiencing my Rahu Ketu half return, I'm a Rahu Aquarius, Ketu Leo. And when Rahu went into Leo and Ketu went into Aquarius, Sunil John from Saptarishi Astrology contacted me. And he said, we want you to come and work for our company. And I said, well, this will be the greatest honor. And I worked for them for over 3 years, making at least 30 or 40 videos on astrocartography and how to improve our karma with the various planets. And I even know other astrologers who also kind of hit their peak or prime during this Rahu Ketu return or Rahu and Ketu half return. They start to get acknowledgement of their karma. Because when you look at Rahu and Ketu, it's all about the completion of our karma. Ketu, what karma have we maybe experienced a lot of, but is partially unfinished? But we have that samskara from Ketu. And then Rahu is the what karma which we have to complete in this lifetime, or what we call our unfinished business.
Right.
Or as I like to call it, the soul's bucket list. So when you're looking at Rahu transiting Rahu in the ascendancy, let's say you're a Taurus ascendant, that first house will be affected quite dramatically. That first house will be affected quite dramatically because it represents, first of all, the Ayurvedic doshas of the body. Rahu is Vata planet. So if you have, now luckily you got that earth energy from Taurus, but Rahu is still Vata planet. So when Rahu returns to that natal position in the ascendancy, the person can deal with lots of Vata type disturbances.
Right.
Even though it's returning to its exalted position according to Parashara, it could be a time of, let's call them side effects, where the person is materialistic, where the person is superficial. Now on the higher side of that, there's mystical and occult spiritual goals. So it's all about which direction you go. You know, Rahu gets a bad rap a lot of the time as a planet that is out to get us or is against us. But actually, our ability to lead a certain type of spiritual life, have a certain type of consciousness, can make Rahu a very sattvic, benefic energy in our lives if we allow it to.
Right.
And often they say that when we're dealing with difficulties with Rahu, we look at Ketu, because Ketu is going to help fill some of the answers in to how to cure some of the troubles of your Rahu. So if you have the Rahu ascendancy returning to its natal position in exaltation, that's going to be for the most part good. But I had to talk about the side effects. Now the good effects is material growth, material wealth, recognition, success, you know, traveling, all sorts of positive things can come about that. But on the severe side of it, Rahu in the first house is all about finding your identity.
Right.
So if you're having this Rahu return, you could be having what's called a midlife crisis, or what you call just an identity crisis, which is like you're rediscovering yourself. And hopefully you're rediscovering yourself in a mystical and a spiritual way. But a lot of times when people have these kind of midlife crises, they kind of fall off the wagon. So we have to be careful that Rahu stays on the wagon if it's transiting your natal ascendancy. Now, at the same time that that will be happening, Ketu will be transiting the 7th house, its exalted form. This is extremely powerful in terms of relationships and marriage. It's exalted, but like I said, that's not always 100% good when we're talking about Rahu and Ketu. It's going to come with side effects. So what happens when Ketu becomes exalted, if you have a natal Ketu, Scorpio in the 7th house, what's going to happen is if you're in a relationship already or you're married, if that person is in alignment with your highest spiritual frequency, then it will be one of the most fantastic times of your life as far as your spiritual growth and your connection with your partner. However, because of the strong exaltation of Ketu, let's say your boyfriend or husband or wife or girlfriend is not exactly in alignment with your spiritual path, it indicates the destruction of the relationship.
Right.
So the transit of Ketu on that 8th house is definitely going to be a make or break type energy for any kind of relationship. Now, if you're not in a relationship, that Ketu energy in the 7th house can bring past lifetime partners into your life, people to complete your karma with. And because of the Rahu in the ascendancy, materiality, superficiality, what's the best way to get those things out of your mind? The experience of love.
Right.
So naturally, there's this balance of the exaltation of Rahu in the ascendancy and the desire to experience love and companionship. And it's actually a great period for marriage for certain people who haven't been married before and have been waiting for themselves for the right person. But people who are unhappily married are likely to get divorced during this period.
Oh.
Highly likely. Just like the people who are happily married and on a similar spiritual path should be extremely happy and joyous together.
Right.
Now, let's say it's a half return. So you got Ketu on Rahu now in the 1st house. Ketu is a tail which has no head. It's blind. So if you thought Rahu in the 1st house was going to give you an identity crisis, wait till Ketu transits your Rahu in your 1st house. Mokshakarika. See, Rahu wants things. It wants this, and it wants it now, and it's going to do whatever it takes to get it. But Ketu is the Mokshakarika, all about letting go of, surrender, not returning. So this is a much more difficult transit than Rahu transiting its own itself, because the things that you gain during this Rahu period, which an exalted Rahu in the ascendant, if the Ketu transit is hitting that, those things could come and go. So you may come into a large sum of money, but you might have to spend that large sum of money.
Right.
You know, or because of Ketu, you might come into a large sum of money, but it's at the cost of the loss of a loved one, maybe an elderly loved one, and you're inheriting money.
Right.
So the half return there is really powerful. Now, when the karma of Ketu comes back to Rahu in the ascendancy for the half return, like when it did for me, your past life to karmas, whatever kind of actions or life that you lived in your past lives, you'll kind of revisit them. So I became a Jyotisha
Right.
during my Rahu and Ketu half return. And it really wasn't a choice. I was studying Ayurveda at the time for a few years. I took Jyotish, and by the end of the class, the teacher and the students and the whole school was asking me to read their charts, and then people started giving me money, and I just didn't have time to study Ayurveda anymore. So it's a wonderful thing when the destiny that is intended for us, we're going towards it and we want to go towards it. But let's say a person's destiny or their karma is more difficult, like they're meant to be in the army or something. Well, that could be a more difficult transit for the individual. But the fact that Rahu and Ketu are going to their exalted positions, if the Rahu transit hits it, it should be good. But if the Ketu transit hits it, it might not be what you thought it would be.
Right.
Like before I became a Jyotisha, I was living in Peru to become a shaman.
Nice.
So I had no idea I was going to be a Jyotisha. Even though I heard Jyotish when I was 7 years old from my uncle, I had no idea when I was going to become a Jyotisha until it really started happening. And that's part of that Ketu energy. Now, if Rahu transits Ketu in the 7th house during this upcoming transit, that could be very impactful, the half return there. This is a time where you can easily come in contact with partners that you've had in past lifetimes. But Rahu is transiting that Ketu. So maybe you have some karma to complete with this person, but it wouldn't necessarily indicate that they would be the best person for you to spend the rest of your life with.
Right.
So if you're having the direct transit of Rahu and Ketu on the 1st and the 7th house, that's more like, this could be my soulmate for the rest of my life. If you're having the half return transit and that Ketu's hitting, Rahu's hitting the 7th house, it might feel like that's your partner, but you just have karma to complete together.
Right.
Which might mean dating, which might mean a relationship, but it could just mean friendship.
Right.
You avoid a lot of pain that way.
Yeah.
People avoid a lot of pain that way. And so just to be careful not to confuse friendship with love.
Right.
When that transit hits your chart. And Rahu can be confusing. So just know that you could be confused, you know? So that's a little bit of the Rahu return and the Rahu half return on the 1st and the 7th houses. The next will be the 2nd and the 8th houses.
Right. What about if somebody has Ketu in the 1st house and Ketu is transiting over the Ketu and Rahu in the 7th house and Rahu's transiting over their 7th house?
Oh yeah, if someone has Ketu in the 1st house, this is one of the most powerful times of their life for them to reach their full spiritual potential.
Right.
Although Ketu can be kind of cruel in a sense of, if it gives us a hint as to which direction we should go, which if Ketu is transiting your ascendancy, it's certainly going to be giving you hints. That if you don't listen to those hints, Ketu will hit you with a hammer in the head.
Right.
And a lot of times with Ketu, it has to do with letting go of the things in our life that don't serve us properly.
Right.
Certain things are obvious, like alcohol, you know, having intimacy without love.
Right.
These things are obvious things to avoid. And it's all about the maturity of the ability for the person to let go of those things that are holding them back. I mean, for a very heavy person, it's a chocolate bar.
Right.
You know, but if you're an opiate addict, it could be heroin.
Yeah.
So just, it's a really important time for the liberation of that individual.
Yes.
And the growth of that individual, but they have to be willing to let go of things that please them, like the Rahu in the 7th house will be. Things that please them, people that please them, that might not be serving them in the ideal way.
Right.
So there's going to be a lot of energy of just, okay, I'm looking myself in the mirror and I realize this person, this thought habit, this pattern, it's not serving me anymore. So I'm going to do my best to let it go.
Right.
So if it's drinking, I'm going to try to be sober. And what you'll see is that'll transform the person into a much higher spiritual dignity.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You know, they could become much more, if they chose, like they weren't in a relationship or anything. We'll talk more about Rahu in the 7th. But if they weren't in a relationship or anything, it would be a perfect time to take brahmacharya.
Okay.
And not saying for the rest of their life, but when you take that vow of brahmacharya, when the chart aligns for the brahmacharya, it usually invites the right soulmate into your lifetime by the time the vow is over. So I never recommend my clients take lifetime vow of brahmacharya unless they have a sannyasi yoga in their chart.
Right.
But it might be beneficial for the exalted Ketu ascendants at this time to take short vows of celibacy, to focus on themselves and their spiritual lives, and also romantically to magnetize the right person towards them. Now with Rahu in the 7th house, it will be exalted. So the partners that people can encounter this time could be very wealthy. They could be very powerful. They could be very mystical, very spiritual. They can love foreign cultures. They can love to travel. They can love to have fun. They love excitement and adventure. And there's all these positive things about having Rahu in the 7th house as a single person and meeting somebody. But Rahu can also be a little bit deceptive. So Rahu in the 7th house, the person, that's the house of marriage. So the person may think that, oh, wow, I really found the one. But then that person will take some kind of action that will make them question that. Some kind of maybe sneaky type action. And even though Rahu is exalted, it might not be infidelity specifically in terms of being with another partner, but it could become their obsession with their ego, their obsession with money, and how they prioritize their wants and desires and money and ego over the desires and needs and wants of their partner. So with that Rahu in the 7th house, it's going to crave companionship. It's going to really hate to be lonely because that K2 energy in the 1st house is pulling that person into a very isolated state. So that companionship is so important. And yet ultimately it's suggesting that we can't settle for someone who's who's less than perfect for us.
Right.
Because if we do, it just ends up causing both people great amounts of pain.
Right. Right.
And just like Ketu in the 7th house in its transit, natal, and Rahu, it's a make or break time for any relationship. You know, can you embody and celebrate this energy together? Or is one of you going to follow it and the other one's going to not? And that's going to create a separation of energies between two people. Also, we know the 7th house is the house of business contracts and business dealings and things. So Rahu will be exalted. So you think that's a good time to make a business deal or a business contract. But Rahu's there. So don't be afraid that if your business partner is trying to get the better side of the deal, trying to get higher percentage, trying to take advantage of you, it's not a bad time to get into business contracts, investments, dealings, and things like that. But you got to have a lawyer look over that paperwork.
Right.
Because it's also highly likely that your business partner might try to take advantage of you. You know? It was like at one point, Steve Jobs didn't own Apple.
Right.
Because the contracts got all messed up and he didn't own Apple anymore, even though he created everything. So, you know, these things happen. So moving on, 2nd house, 8th house energy. When you have the Rahu return or Rahu's return to its natal position in the 2nd house, it's a house of wealth and it's a house of family. So you can expect a lot more interaction with your family. And it's exalted. So usually with people with Rahu in the 2nd house, they always kind of have a strange relationship with their family members.
Mm-hmm.
But with this exalted return, that strange relationship hits its peak.
Okay.
So that means even though it might be a little non-conventional, non-traditional parent-child relationship, its potential for it to be close is closer than ever.
Okay.
To travel together, to have fun together. The 2nd house is to have food, to cook food together. And also, it's an Artabhava house, a house of material wealth. And Rahu in the sign of Taurus, a material sign, shows a great potential for material gains with Rahu in the 2nd house if the natal return is there.
Okay.
When you're looking at Ketu in the 8th house and its natal return there, it will be exalted, and the 8th sign is Scorpio, and it'll be exalted in the 8th house.
Right.
It's going to be good and challenging for the individual. Now, if they're interested in anything mystical, occult, esoteric, Ayurveda, Jyotish, Vastu, palmistry, Marma, their ability to deepen their knowledge or wisdom of this information during this time is extremely high. And actually, as I mentioned, Ketu is a tail which has no head. So these people might not be available of these deep, secret, hidden spiritual gifts that they have. And only through the experimentation of that Scorpio energy are they going to find out that they really have those gifts.
Right.
You know, I didn't know I was an astrologer till I did a bunch of chart readings. You know, it's you got to get your hands dirty before you realize.
Right. Right.
But the 8th house is also a moksha house. So there's some considerable side effects to be considered. Ketu's a Pitta planet, and Scorpio can be very Pitta sign. And the 8th house is a house of chronic disease. So when you have this return of Ketu in the 8th house, these people do have to be concerned about their health to some extent. And they have to take very special care of their health, which is probably what leads them to Ayurveda and Jyotish, ways of sustaining their life and their health for the rest of their life. And then also, as its relationship to Rahu being in the 2nd house in its exalted wealth position, and the 8th house is the house of inheritance and debt. If there's any activation that shows that you will inherit a large amount of money during this transit, it would be something like a Rahu Ketu transit on your 2nd and 8th houses. Now, the half return would look a little bit different. Let's say that Ketu is sitting on that Rahu in the 2nd house. The person wants money. The person wants to become closer to their family. But that's not what the stars have in alignment for them. It actually wants them to become less materialistic. Odds are that there might be some excessive ego or materiality in their identity.
Right.
So the Ketu in that position will be naturally trying to purge that. And when the Ketu returns to that position, it pretty much is going to be getting rid of all material things in your life that you don't really need, which is what we call a minimalistic lifestyle. You know, we have so many things. We have so many stuff as human beings. I mean, I'm a Libra Venus, so, you know, I wear gems and I like good food and I like pretty things and things like that. But ultimately, if you have this transit of Ketu coming into your 2nd house, you're going to be wanting to let go of all of that stuff. Rahu's falling into the 8th house. And if Rahu's falling into its exalted position in the 8th house, that's its signification position. So that means the person, Rahu is the full realization of our mystical or occult potential. So if there's any time in a person's life where if they want to focus their life spiritually, which means to develop a daily sadhana, because the demon before Rahu was created, Swarbhanu, he was known to have an incredible daily sadhana. Even though he wanted to live forever, which made him an Asurya, he was extremely devout to Lord Shiva and did penance to him. And so there's this energy of, okay, maybe religion isn't right for me, but what is everything spiritual, mystical, God-related, outside of dogmatic rules in religion that I can incorporate into my life?
Right.
And a little bit about the half returns. If Rahu, if that Ketu, we talked about Ketu transiting that Rahu. If Rahu is transiting the Ketu in the 8th house, the person will be desiring, you know, those mystical experiences. But Rahu likes to take shortcuts.
Right.
So it doesn't mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, But just like how Swarbhanu drank the Amritam before the gods could kill him, a Rahu in the 8th house during this exalted transit will do just about whatever it takes if it thinks it's becoming more enlightened. And that includes drug, that includes false guru, you know, like, I mean, certain mind-altering experiences. I know in India they use the bhanga on Shivaratri.
Right.
In Peru they drink the ayahuasca. And so there are certain plants that are extremely powerful and can be used ritualistically and spiritually for prayer and spiritual growth. But the real downfall of this transit of Ketu being in the 8th house and Rahu transiting it is, instead of doing the ritualistic use of things, you fall to the recreational use of things.
Right.
And you're attracted to alcohol and tobacco and cocaine and other of these more recreational drugs which have no spiritual value,
Right.
that have been altered, you know, with chemicals and additives and all sorts of things. So just to keep that in mind, that with this transit of Rahu or the half return of Rahu in the 8th house, a person might be attracted to shortcuts on their spiritual path.
Okay.
Now, when you take a mind-altering substance, even if it's a ritualistic one like bhanga or ayahuasca, and you're praying to Lord Shiva, you get a glimpse into that mystical realm. But eventually that dravya, that substance that you took, the guna, the effect of it is going to wear off.
Right.
So all you're really getting is to look through the hole in a door.
Right.
When really it's the daily sadhana, daily spiritual practice, daily dedication and prayers to God that will lead you to that door in a more sustainable way. It doesn't mean you can't get a glimpse of it through ritual, but there's no way to get there permanently through the use of anything outside of ourselves. We can only get through there permanently by going inside. And I think that's what Ketu is to tell us.
Right.
Wonderful. So that's just a little bit about the 2nd and the 8th house. So we got the 1st and 7th house covered, 2nd and 8th house covered on this upcoming transit. And now we'll get a little into the 3rd and the 9th houses. Very interesting effects coming up. Hello and welcome back, everyone. And we're excited to discuss the transit of Rahu and Ketu as they go into their exalted positions of Taurus and Scorpio, and how that's going to affect all of the various planets in the natal chart. We just covered the 1st, 7th, 2nd, and 8th houses, and now we're moving on to the 3rd and 9th. Now, if Rahu's in your 3rd house, this is considered a good position for Rahu. And when the Rahu returns happen there in its exalted position, it's a really good return for Rahu's position, because the 3rd house is an upachaya house. It's a house of self-improvement and evolution. And Rahu, it's also a Kama house. And we also know a lot about Rahu. He is full of Kama. So this energy is considered actually a good position for Rahu and a good position for the return of Rahu. And see, why it's such a good position is a lot of times with Rahu and the people and the problems that people have with Rahu, they don't want to work on them.
Right.
They don't want to change. Whichever Rahu way they are, they can be stubborn and set in that way.
Right.
But when Rahu enters the third house, and then you have your natal return of your Rahu in your third house, all of those things of Rahu that we don't want to work on, it pushes us to work on those things. It pushes us to grow. It pushes us to look in the mirror. It pushes us to, the third house is a house of siblings. So of course, it's exalted, so there can be a closeness with siblings at this time. And Rahu's there, so maybe your sibling does something really, really weird and cool. And but if Ketu's transiting it, that's more concerning, because its effect on siblings would mean that, okay, well, maybe your sibling is up to no good. Maybe they're getting into a little bit of trouble.
Right.
So if you're an older sibling like me, that means that you got to figure out what kind of trouble they're getting into and try to get them out of it.
Right.
I don't know how younger siblings handle it, but I imagine they hold their breath. Now, because of the upachaya vibration of the third house, a lot of ambition and motivation and intentions come from that third house. And so there will be a lot of ambitions and intentions and motivations growing within the individual. And Rahu represents our mystical or occult potential. So the person may have not really been interested in the mystical before, and then all of a sudden they become more interested in the mystical. And Ketu's transit on that Rahu, the half return there, wouldn't really affect that either. The person would still be very drawn and attracted to the mystical.
Right.
It just, if Rahu is in the third house, it's going to be having the people work very, very hard on letting go of their material attachments.
Right.
Things like food and money and jewelry and houses and land and cars. It's going to be working on you on not having such a close attachment to those things.
Right.
But if Ketu is in the third house, it's not as good as a position for Ketu, because the third house is also the house of speaking and communication. And Ketu can create a challenge there, even though that it's in its exalted form, that sometimes that can be in a very aggressive energy when it's communicated orally. It doesn't mean that the person isn't speaking the truth.
Right.
But Ketu is the destroyer of the ego. So people with Ketu in returning in their third house, or Ketu transiting their natal Rahu in their third house, have to be very careful that their tongue does not turn into a sword.
Right. Right.
And there's a lot of opportunity for growth and new intentions and new motivations and new ambitions and improvement with the relationship with your siblings. Although if Ketu is there, we also have to be concerned about the health of our siblings to some extent.
Right.
Now, instead of Rahu being positioned in the third house, what happens if Ketu's positioned in the third house? And you're having your Ketu return there. This will be a very powerful transit in terms of all of these energies in your chart, of what your ambitions and motivations and intentions have been throughout your life. Scorpio is extremely transformative.
Right.
So what you used to want to do, how you used to want to spend your time, where you used to want to put your energy, there's a high chance that that could be changing. with the Ketu return in the third house. Also randomly, maybe one of your siblings moves to a distant country.
Right.
Now, if Rahu was to transit the natal return, your natal position of your Ketu in your third house, if Rahu's about to transit that,
Right.
there's more things that you need to be careful of, such as the side effects of your siblings taking advantage of you. And maybe your ambitions, motivations, and intentions, not that they're wrong, but that you have to question them.
Right.
You have to question them. Because with Rahu coming in there, your priorities are supposed to be changing so they're in alignment with your highest spiritual frequency. But Rahu can present Maya or illusion. So you might think during this transit, if Rahu's hitting that Ketu, that you want to do this. Once you start doing it, you realize you don't want to do it anymore. So just even before really, if Rahu is hitting that Ketu in your third house, really, contemplating heavily if that's the direction you want to shift your energy and your priorities and your motivations towards. Because the Rahu will be tempted to push them in a material position.
Right.
And the Ketu's natural natal position will be wanting to keep them in a spiritual position.
Right.
So yeah, you have to be tempted. You have to kind of fight off those material temptations and priorities. If you're having a Rahu return in the third house or Rahu transit on your Ketu in the third house.
Right.
While if Rahu's there and Ketu's transiting it through half return, it's much more just about letting go of our material attachments so that we can spiritually grow.
Right.
So again, the third house is not a bad position for Rahu. It's a good position for Rahu. And it's even an average position for Ketu. And a return there should be fairly auspicious.
Okay.
Now, as we look into the fourth house, we see a fourth house, 10th house aspect.
Right.
Whenever Rahu or Ketu are in the Kendras, first, fourth, seventh, 10th house, that gives them dominance over the Kundalini channels of your body and has a heavy impact.
Right.
So if you're having your Rahu return in your fourth house, we know that the fourth house is the house of mother.
Right.
It's exalted. So it could be a time for deepening your relationship with your mother. It could be a time for traveling with your mother, or it could just show that your mother is going through a dramatic change in her life.
Right.
Like, for example, maybe your mother's going through menopause.
Right.
Or divorce.
Right.
Or moving.
Right.
But it kind of shows, because of its exalted position, a closeness between the child and their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And because of Rahu, it might be a little strange in terms of being too much of a mama's boy.
Right.
And I'm a little bit of a mama's boy myself. And I'm a Rahu ascendant, and my mom's a Rahu Cancer ascendant, and I have Jupiter in the fourth house. So it's just natural.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it has this energy of the deep connection with the mother. And then ultimately, that's the Divine Mother.
Right.
That's the Divine Mother. That's Amma, Amritanandamaya, that's Durga, that is Parvati, that is Saraswati. It is all the manifestations of the Divine Mother. So when that Rahu return transits your fourth house, that's the house of home.
Right.
That means that your home can either turn into a rave. Do you know rave?
Brave, yeah.
A party with lights and alcohol and drugs.
Right.
Or it can turn into a temple.
Right.
And that's where we see the movable energy show up a little bit. You know, the grahas means to grab or to influence our karma.
Right.
But great Parahamsa Yogananda said that the truly devout spiritual yogi can transcend the malefic influences of their chart. So I think this is a good example to bring that up and say that, okay, having Rahu in the fourth house in this exalted transit, one of its side effects is that you could become a real partier in your home. Or you can turn your home into a temple.
Right.
A place of spiritual sanctity and dignity.
Right.
And because it's also in the house of home and it's aspecting the house of career, you have to think, okay, well, there's also some money work-related stuff coming through here. And a lot of it has to do with potential for real estate.
Okay.
And also potential for working from home and making money from home. And usually Rahu and Taurus is really good at investing.
Right.
So you can make a lot of money if you have a natal return of Rahu in the fourth house, doing home investments, stocks and whatnot.
Right.
Especially with the exalted Ketu sitting in your 10th house. That exalted Ketu, as it returns to your 10th house. Now, we associate Ketu with spirituality, moksha, but on a deeper level, Ketu is that planet which wants us to get to our highest potential in this lifetime, which is our dharma, which will help lead us to moksha. But not always in this lifetime are we anywhere close to moksha.
Right.
Sometimes we have dharmic responsibilities. So sometimes having Ketu in the 10th house, it means that your career is moksha, but most of the time, what it ends up being is that your career is extremely meaningful or powerful.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual. You could be a governor. You could be a judge or justice. You could be a president. You could be a prime minister. You could be a professional athlete. All of these different things, which are really the top things, Hollywood celebrity actor. You see all these potential things show up when you hit that Ketu return in the 10th house. Because whatever your potential is, as far as your skills and talents in your career go, they will come out during the return. Now, if you're having the half return, which means that Rahu's in the fourth house and Ketu's transiting it, this can be very difficult for the person in finding comfort in terms of the home. Where do I go? Where do I stay? Where is my homeland? And it actually creates difficulties with the family members.
Right.
Saying that some family members, if you have natal position Rahu in the 4th house, and then the exalted Ketu transits that, you can have toxic family members, which means you have family members, and yeah, you love them, but they don't serve you having them in your life.
Right.
And so it's very important for you to step away from them in your life. And that takes courage and that takes confidence. And the combination of Rahu and Ketu in that 4th house can really help do that, especially when you have a career to focus on while the 10th house is being fully activated. Now, let's say Ketu is in the 4th house.
Right.
Ketu in the 4th house has to do with a lot of the times just not even its natal position, regardless of sign, has to do with a person living and being born in a place that they are not going to be the most successful, because the Rahu falls into the 10th house. So where are they going to reach their full career potentials? Probably not in their homeland.
Right.
Or probably not with something from their homeland. You know, even as a Rahu ascendant, my career is Vedic astrology. You know, so there is this energy of having that Ketu in the 4th house and the Rahu in the 10th house and saying, okay, my career is going to be potentially more successful outside of my country I was born, outside of the country of my ancestors. And I need the courage to be able to do that. I need to be able the courage to not necessarily work a job that my society tells me is a job that I should be working, but rather following that intuitive flow inside of yourself and allowing that to blossom. I mean, people with Ketu in the 10th house can be huge celebrities.
Right.
Especially if Ketu is exalted. But they have to be willing to break the cycle of being in the same place at the same time. If they're born in a small town in the middle of nowhere, if they want to be successful, they got to get out of there.
Right.
Now, if the Rahu is hitting that Ketu in the 10th house by the half return, it can be a little bit more confusing in terms of, okay, there's a lot of different potentials for me in terms of my skills as far as what my career could be. So I'm a little bit confused about which one to do.
Right.
And that doesn't, the last thing you want to do in that position, especially because of the exaltation potential, is to not try anything because you're not sure.
Right.
What would be more indicated as the remedial technique of that transit is to try as many things as possible until you find the right thing.
Right.
And when Rahu is transiting, when Rahu is transiting that Ketu in the 4th house, this sense of home, it can be hard to grasp. Because Rahu is the outcast. Rahu is the black sheep.
Right.
Rahu always gets the blame when it's not Rahu's fault.
Right. Right.
So, happened too much to me growing up. So, in this case, you're still looking for a home. You're still looking for that career that's going to suit you. But again, you might have to, with Rahu's influence in transit, half return, you might have to try on a few different things before you find the right thing.
Right.
And before I was a Jyotisha, I was a resort manager in Aruba. Then I was a cafe manager, and then I was learning to become a shaman in Peru. So there are many different things along my path before I finally landed on my Dharma. And that's something that you have to really, really, really be concerned about when Rahu and Ketu are sitting in your 10th house. You're having that return, and you're having that half return. And it's good when Rahu and Ketu are naturally there and returning to their natal positions. And it's more challenged when Rahu and Ketu transit those houses.
Right.
Like Rahu transiting Ketu and Ketu transiting Rahu. That can be more challenging. You know, like, I'll just open up a little bit with you and the community here. And when I was having my Rahu Ketu half return, my most passionate area of Jyotish is how we can improve our spiritual relationship with the various grahas.
Oh, beautiful.
And when I told Sunil that at Saptarishi Astrology, when he offered me the job, he said, you can do as many videos as you want on that. But first, you have to do 10 videos on Vedic astrocartography.
Okay.
Because I had become well known for that.
Right.
But it's not my passion.
Right.
And yet, it's still something that I had to do so that I could finally do my passionate series. And still every day, Kapil had me on his channel. Still every day, people want that astrocartography advice from me. And I like doing it. But way more important to me is how to remedy all of our karmas together.
Right.
So we have 4 more houses to cover. First, we'll move on to the 5th house and the 11th house. Now, there's a few different indications of the 5th house, but the 5th house is the house of children. We know that. It's the house of our offspring. Right. So when Rahu enters an exalted position there, it usually suggests high fertility in both a man and a woman. And then a high, how do I put this in a politically correct way? They also have a high tantric drive.
Right.
This increases their tantric drive incredibly so.
That's Rahu in the 5th house?
Yeah, and its return.
Right.
So if you're married and you want to have children, there's no better time.
Right.
But Rahu is known to bring surprises. So let's say you're not even necessarily trying or wanting to. I mean, I'll be married almost just over a year when the transit starts. And it's very possible by the end of the transit, my wife could be pregnant. I don't know.
Right.
So, so you have to consider this. If you want to have a child, that Rahu return in your 5th house, it's a great time to try. If you don't want to have a child, it's the most important time to be careful.
Right.
Women wear birth control, men wear birth control. One or the other.
Right.
And if you don't want to have a child, because there's high indications that you would accidentally have one.
Right.
And of a lot of the charts I've read, most surprise pregnancies come from Rahu in the 5th house.
Wow, interesting.
And so it'll be exalted. So, you know, it'll be coming into a very powerful time in the universe, and that child will be born with an exalted Rahu and Ketu in their chart. So you're
Yes.
bringing them into the world into a very powerful time.
Right.
I mean, I get excited at the idea, you know, but I don't think we should bring our children into the world based on the transit.
Right.
You know, I'm like, oh, I tell my wife, I really want our kids to have exalted Rahu and Ketu. And she's like, that's not a good reason. So we have to consider that with Rahu in the 5th house. Now, if Ketu is transiting that with the half return,
right.
It's less likely that the individual would want to have children, but also more likely that it would be a surprise.
Okay.
So if you have a Ketu transiting your natal Rahu there, and you don't want to have children, married, not married, whatever it is, you have to be extremely careful with birth control and everything to do to prevent pregnancy.
Right.
Now, the 5th house is also a house of education, so let's not forget that.
Right.
And Rahu does not like traditional education.
Right.
It prefers outside of the box education. I was a philosophy and hospitality major in college, so I didn't take very many regular classes.
Right.
You know, I learned about resorts, hotels, and about every different philosophy there is. So when you get this Rahu in the 5th house and it's activated by the Gochar and you're having that return,
Right.
you can have this deep, deep desire for education. But I'm not talking about law school. I'm not talking about medical school. I'm not even talking about business school. Of all the major schools, business would be the most likely.
Right.
But it's really kind of education, which is outside of the box, which is outside of the confines of society, which can include Jyotish, Ayurveda, Vastu, energy healing, massage, giving people tours, like tourism, like taking people on tourism tours. I've seen that there. It's not a bad position unless you're not careful about having children and you don't want one.
Right.
Then it can be very difficult because all of a sudden you wake up and you're pregnant.
Right.
If you're a woman. And if you're a man, the 5th house is also the house of romantic attraction. So hopefully you're married, but it's possible that the person could get pregnant in a premarital relation.
Okay.
And that leads to all sorts of conflicts, whether they give up adoption or surrogacy or abortion. I'm not here to talk politics, but I'm saying that it creates, when you don't want to have a child and then you have one, it creates a lot of conflict in a person's life. And even in a couple's life, if they don't want to have one, if they're not ready to have one yet.
Right.
You know, a lot of time people, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. So until we fulfill our obligations in terms of arta, what we want to do with our lives here in the material world, we're not necessarily ready to be a parent just yet.
Right.
Till we've done what we want to do and traveled where we want to travel to.
Absolutely.
It always helps to get those things out of the way first. Otherwise, the person goes their whole life wondering woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Right, right.
Now, if Ketu is in the 5th house, or Ketu is transiting that Rahu in the 5th house, it's less likely that the person will want to have children and less likely that they will be fertile to have children. Although because it's exalted, there's still the high potential for surprise.
Right.
But Scorpio is indicated for medicine, and it's in the 9th house of education. So while Rahu in the 9th house, as far as graduate school and college, it indicates business.
Right.
Ketu in the 5th house in Scorpio indicates medicine and pre-medical studies.
Right.
So a little bit of a different shift area there. Now, as far as your relationship with your children, let's say you already have children. Ketu being there usually indicates that the child is going through maturity stage or a rapid change in their growth. Oftentimes I see that the 5th house Ketu activated when a child goes to college.
Okay.
And then the parents are left at home with each other and no kids in the house.
Right.
Which some parents are counting the days until, and other parents are crying as their child leaves. And so you get both sides of the spectrum there. But having that Ketu in the 5th house is really a lot of it as far as the having a child aspect. If you have a child, you know, as a parent, if we have a child, we try to raise that child with good values, good actions, good principles, morality, ethics, spirituality, etc. But when that Ketu return hits that 5th house, you have to let the child go on its own.
Right.
Not as much influence. The parents are not supposed to influence as much. And if Rahu's having a half return on that Ketu in the 5th house, the child may rebel against their parents.
Right.
Only if their parents try to kind of tell them what to do. The remedy for the parents in that situation is, okay, my child is going through an experimental phase of exploring different things. And that can mean anything. And some of that can make a parent nervous.
Right.
You know, we don't have to go into specifics because I don't like to get into political, but children experiment with all sorts of things now, especially as they get into their teenage years.
Right.
You know, especially with sex and drugs and things like that.
Right.
And you want to protect them, but you can't control them or there will be a rebelliousness against you.
Right.
So that's something to consider. Now let's move to the 11th house aspect. Now, Rahu in the 11th house, that's the house of friends. And we said Rahu is always a friend in me anyway. But Rahu transiting into its natal position, Taurus has to do with loyalty, stability, and security. So if you're having your Rahu return in your 11th house, it could be one of the most enjoyable and beneficial times for friendship in your entire lifetime.
Right.
You can have friends which you haven't talked to for 5-10 years, all of a sudden come back and be key players and key supporters and key advocates in your life. And Rahu also represents new experiences and new friendships. And it's exalted. So you might actually make or become new best friends with someone during the transit of the Rahu return in the 11th house. Doesn't matter what age you are. I mean, I'm in my 30s. I don't make any new best friends. But I have Saturn and Mula in the 11th house. And when that gets activated, I notice that I start to develop new friendships, and they get very deep very quickly. You know, with my students and people I meet in the Jyotish community, I find that those friendships really blossom.
Right.
So Rahu is considered a good position in the 11th house. Some say that Rahu co-rules Aquarius, and Aquarius is the natural house of the 11th.
Right.
So Aquarius is the 11th sign. So Rahu really likes the 11th house. Now, the 11th house is also profits. That Rahu has high material potential. So that Rahu return in the 11th house gives extreme amount of material potential for growth during this period. But one of the things that I say is that with Rahu, even though it's exalted, it's usually a risk-reward scenario.
Right.
No pain, no gain. So you have to take a certain risk in order to get that financial reward. Now, if Rahu is on its own and you're having your natal return there and there's no harmful aspects, you may be taking a risk and you'll do very well on that risk. Like, let's say you got some Bitcoins back in the year 2000.
Right.
And Rahu does have to do with e-currency, by the way. So it's not a bad time to invest in e-currency as we go into this transit. By the end of the transit, the value of e-currency, Bitcoins, Litecoins, all of that stuff will be much, much higher than it is now. And since Corona, it's dropped pretty rapidly.
Right.
So you'll see, once the vaccine and everything, a huge resurgence of these cryptocurrencies. And you're already seeing ATMs for them.
Oh, interesting.
At malls here in Philadelphia, there's Bitcoin ATMs. So, so it's a very interesting position for both friendship and material gains. Now, if you're having your half return there and Ketu is hitting there, it's going to be like a split. Certain
Right.
people will come into your life friendship-wise that are meant to be there, but Ketu, as its Mokshakarika, will take all of the friends that are not really your friends, which are not really your advocates, which are not really helping your spiritual growth. They'll rip them right away from your life.
Right.
And sometimes they take them out of your life by them doing cruel things to you.
Right.
So, again, we mentioned drugs and alcohol. People are much more capable of doing cruel things when they're under the influence of drugs and alcohol.
Right.
So to all of the people who are having Rahu, Ketu, or half returns in that 11th house, be very careful about your friends who do drugs or drink alcohol, because they may do something to hurt you.
Okay.
Now, if Ketu is in the 11th house, I love Ketu in the 11th house. It's not necessarily a signification point, but
Right.
as the house of friendship and Ketu being so radically mystical, I find that people with Ketu in the 11th house, even though they're friends let's say they don't spend as much time with them, their friends are really interesting people,
Right.
especially in its exalted form. Mystical, occult, wise people.
Right.
Gurus, but they won't call themselves gurus.
Right.
But people who possess wisdom, spiritual knowledge, that's the kind of friend that you'll be attracted to by having Ketu in the 11th house.
Right.
Now, as far as profits and gains in the 11th house, Ketu not so supportive of that. We recently saw a few years ago when Ketu is in Aquarius, a little bit of that energy.
Right.
And it kind of shows that it's more important that we're doing what's fulfilling to us in terms of our hearts and our spirits than how much money we can make.
Right.
Which is almost the opposite of the return of Rahu in your second house.
Right.
Is that return of Ketu in your 11th house. Now, let's say that Rahu is having a half return transit on that Ketu.
Mm-hmm.
For friendship, it means that you may think that you have everyone as your friend, but they're not necessarily your friend.
Right.
So I just want to conclude with talking about the last two houses that we haven't covered yet, which are the 6th house and the 12th house. And then we'll get into the rest of the planets in our second and third part here.
Right.
But Rahu does very well in the 6th house. Just like the 3rd house, it's an Upachaya house. It pushes us. It's also considered a Drake in the house by some, but it pushes us to self-improvement and evolution. It's a house of service. It's the natural house of Virgo, which some consider to be the natural, also one of the positive signs of Rahu.
Right.
So it has a person working on themselves. It has a person being of service. And actually, Rahu's position in the 6th house really helps a person to become less selfish, especially in its exalted form, and be more of service. But the 6th house is also the house of enemies.
Right.
So Rahu in the 6th house, I don't care what sign it's in. That's a difficult position. Because Rahu is Maya, illusion, fog and smoke. So you may think someone is your friend, but they are not. And so one of the real difficulties of Rahu in the 6th house is knowing your friends from your enemies. And the remedy that I have come up with that seems to work best for me and most of my clients as a Rahu person, other people I see Rahu in the 6th house, and then they have something in the 11th house. It's like, oh, who's my friend and who's my enemy and all these things like that, is keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Right.
So if you think someone's your friend, you can be nonchalant friendly to them. If you think someone might be your enemy, and an enemy isn't someone who wants to hurt you, it's just someone who doesn't have your best interest at heart, you really want to go out of your way to being extra kind to that person so they can't dislike you.
Right.
Now, of course, you can still be disliked for being too nice, and there's nothing you can do about that. But the fact that Rahu's exalted kind of shows that you can win over an enemy into a friend. But if Ketu, through its half return, is transiting that 6th house, it's going to be a little bit different because Ketu is destructive. So instead of them just being an enemy, they might try to take destructive actions. And it's also the house of coworkers. So they could try to hurt you in your career. So Rahu in its natal return position in the 6th house, that's good for deciphering who are your friends and your enemies. when you start to pick, if Ketu is transiting that Rahu, or Ketu is in that position in that natal Rahu, and you start to think that someone doesn't have your best interests at heart, they say don't burn bridges, burn the bridge.
Okay.
That means eliminate that person from your life. And this can be shown also strongly by the aspect of the 12th house being activated, which is the house of escape, which is the house of leaving, which is the house of letting go, which is the house of surrender and moksha. So if you have that Ketu in the 6th house and the Rahu in the 12th house, you burn the bridge with your enemies and you're focused more on your spiritual goals and your spiritual enthusiasms. But again, even though Rahu's exalted, Rahu likes to take shortcuts. So I see a lot of people with Rahu in the 12th house. They love the marijuana. They love the ayahuasca. They like peyote, magic mushroom, because they give you a glimpse into samadhi. It might be a 1 hour glimpse. It might be a 2 hour glimpse. It might be a 3 hour glimpse. But you get the slightest, briefest glimpse into it. But that is Maya to think that is permanent. So Rahu's very difficult in the 12th house because you may take a shortcut for your spiritual growth and think that you've gotten there. Like when I was in Peru drinking ayahuasca, I thought that was making me more spiritually evolved. Now it was showing me what I needed to do to become more spiritual, but it didn't do anything for me. So we have to understand that when it comes to these shortcuts, and if Rahu's there and we're attracted to them, it's not that we can't use them or look at them. It's that we can't believe the lie that that's the final destination. The final destination is reaching that place of samadhi through spiritual sadhana. And Ketu in the 12th house is actually karika, signification position. 12th house Ketu shows either this lifetime or in the next few lifetimes, you'll go through the Mahasamadhi. And if Ketu is exalted, that even indicates it even more. I do readings with people. I almost never tell them they will become enlightened because that just feeds their ego.
Right.
But I will tell them that their soul is going in that direction. And if Ketu is in the 12th house, your soul is certainly going in that direction. And I don't care what other material things that you have going on in your chart, that's where your soul is going, is to the Mahasamadhi, to not have fear of death, to not have attachments, and to want to rejoin the Paramatman. But what's aspecting that Ketu in the 12th house? Rahu in the 6th house. I call that the anchor, because the 6th house is the house of work. So while you're striving for moksha and liberation and enlightenment and all these things, you also got some job that you have to work.
Right.
And that keeps you grounded here in the material realm. And because of its exalted form, it could indicate a lot of financial success. So Rahu 6th house, Ketu 12th house return is a lot more auspicious than Rahu 12th house, Ketu 6th house return. And a half return on Rahu in the 6th house, again, confusion between enemies and friends. And if Ketu's in the 6th house, it's kind of similar, but it pushes you towards more a service-oriented lifestyle. And Rahu's transit is saying is, okay, what things in my life are preventing me from being service-oriented?
Right.
What habits in my life are making me more of a selfish person.
Right.
So I think that's a nice introduction on the Rahu and Ketu transit, and the if Ketu transits Rahu, which is called the half return, or if Rahu transits Ketu, which is called the half return. Again, just to summarize what Nav and I have been discussing, everyone always talks about their Saturn return. I would argue that the Rahu Ketu return is just as important, if not more important.
What do you think about, do you also feel the aspects of Rahu Ketu also get activated as in the transits as well?
Of course, of course. So when we get into the second and third part, we'll talk more about the friends and enemies. But when Jupiter aspects Ketu in the transit, it's very beneficial.
Right.
When Saturn transits Rahu, it's very beneficial.
Right.
When Mars transits Rahu, it's extremely difficult.
Right.
When Mercury transits Ketu, aspects Ketu, it's extremely difficult.
Right.
So the aspects can really have a big impact on whether, hey, it looks good at first, but this aspect is taking away that goodness.
Even the house aspects, for example, if someone has Taurus in the first house and natal Rahu's there and transit Rahu activates that, it's also aspecting the seventh house as well, right? In the aspect.
Exactly. So that person who's trying to find their own identity, they're being aspected by that seventh house of relationships. So they're going to have to be learning their identity from someone.
Right.
We can call this a role model. But I don't know about you, but since I've been married, I've taken on a lot of the characteristics of my wife.
Right. Interesting.
And she's taken on some of my characteristics. So you can experience that as well. The aspects really have a heavy impact, especially with Rahu and Ketu.
Right.
More than the other planets, because they're always exactly 15 degrees. They're always exactly opposite each other.
Right. Right.
So they're 100% aspect, which means, well, they might as well be in the same house.
Right. Right.
Like the sun and the moon have that aspect.
Right. Thank you so much for wonderful information and your time, Kṣaṇāti. And we look forward to working with you on our part 5. And I hope everybody enjoys this video. If you guys have any questions, make a comment below and we'll answer it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nav. It's been such an honor and pleasure to be with you today and to discuss this upcoming transit, which is just around the corner. And I look forward to concluding it by discussing the malefics and the benefics in the different houses and how Rahu and Ketu will be hitting them in the future. And I'm sure we'll think of another exciting project after that. So just blessings to all of our viewers. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Shanti, and stay safe and healthy out there.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.